Ah, my beloved, fill the cup that cures today of past regrets and future fears, before he who subtly wrought me into shape should stamp me back to common earth again. Fill the cup, and in the fire of spring the winter garment of repentance fling. Guide me before the tavern's door, so I may attunement from its keeper implore, for only he who this realm contrived, and with imperfections, joys and sorrows entwined, knows what the last dawn of reckoning shall read. Hence, drink, for you know not whence you came, nor why. Drink, for you know not why you go, nor where. Drink. Khayyam was introduced to the Western world after Edward Fitzgerald, an English poet, anonymously published an English rendition of Khayyam's poetry titled The Rubaiyyat of Omar Khayyam in 1859. The Rubaiyyat became a literary sensation, particularly in England and North America, where a great number of Omar Khayyam literary and social clubs emerged almost overnight, whose membership consisted of prominent literary, political, and social figures. More importantly, the Rubaiyyat influenced and inspired the great literary minds of the Western world, such as Ezra Pound, Mark Twain, and T.S. Eliot, to name a few.
Khayyam was known as a mathematician, as an astronomer, and he did very good mathematical and astronomical work, but his poems were not what established his reputation in the Persian-speaking world until very late indeed. Some 700 years after his death, an English poet of genius takes this raw material, which is Khayyam's poetry, and turns it into English poetry so good that it enshrined the name of Omar Khayyam in the English-speaking world to such an extent that even as late as World War II, you had a famous American general called Omar Bradley, who was named after Omar Khayyam. Omar basically joined Milton and Shakespeare and Byron and other great English poets as if he were an English classic himself. The result is a slight misunderstanding. Certainly, Edward Fitzgerald was a very accomplished Persianist, but he allowed the English-speaking world to take Omar Khayyam to be some sort of merry cynic, wine-bibber, skeptic, disbeliever, someone who is basically interested in the joys of this world, in love and wine and song and meat. Whereas the real Omar Khayyam's poetry, when we go back to the Persian, seems rather to be fraught with a sort of mystical wordplay, double meaning that traditional Persian poetry delighted in.
In the case of Fitzgerald's Rubaiyyat, I think the fact that he makes a tessellated eclogue out of the Rubaiyyat, that is a kind of connected story where the various dots of the various stages of life seem to stretch from the morning of creation to the evening of death. That is the feature where he departs very much from the original Persian. I think where he comes brilliantly close to some of the features of Khayyam's poetry is in the single images, in this or that image. Ultimately, however, I think the value of Fitzgerald's versions lies in the fact that he makes of someone who lived 800 years before him, he makes of that person's compositions a way of describing and criticizing his own society. We should not forget that Victorian England was a time when hedonism, agnosticism, aestheticism, and various other literary, cultural, political, and religious orientations were surfacing. It is very important, I think, that the first edition of the Rubaiyyat is published in 1859, the same year in which Darwin publishes his Origin of the Species. I think both of these texts, Fitzgerald's Rubaiyyat and Darwin's Origin of Species, fundamentally question current beliefs, each in its own way, one from the point of view of science, the other from the point of view of literature, one from a genuinely European basis, and the other from a basis totally alien to European, if not totally, at least substantially alien to European trends of thought. But ultimately, it tells us that the use of human imagination causes all fields to converge. It's the imagination that lies behind Darwin's scientific theory, and it's imagination that lay behind Khayyam's Rubaiyis, mediated in this case by Fitzgerald and transplanted brilliantly into the atmosphere of early Victorian England.
When Dick Davis published a new edition in Penguin of Fitzgerald's translation of Omar Khayyam, he says something absolutely astounding. Davis says in his introduction that compared to the volume of Omar Khayyam's quatrain, Fitzgerald's translation of Omar Khayyam have had more influence on English language than Shakespeare or King James version of Bible. I mean, I have never heard of that comparison. It's extraordinary how short and small that translation was, and what a profound influence it had on English language, let alone other aspects. Obviously, the significance of Khayyam in English is not limited on language. That is, Fitzgerald's translation appears in European context at a period when attention to Romanticism as a kind of a check and balance of the European fascination with the Enlightenment is exceedingly important. And the translation is so beautiful, so compelling. Fitzgerald himself was a poet, as is Dick Davis, by the way, today, that his poetry became pure gold for the period in European context. But not only in poetic terms, but in the intellectual history of Europe, because of the impact of Omar Khayyam in the context of romanticist reaction against Enlightenment, rigidity of the Enlightenment, primacy of reason and progress, the significance becomes very enduring to this day.
The English-speaking world discovers Persian literature of the medieval period through Omar Khayyam, because Edward Fitzgerald put his genius to the translating of Omar Khayyam rather than to some other great poet like Firdausi or Hafez or Saadi or Nizami or Attar or even Rumi. Omar Khayyam was the choice. The miracle crystallized around Omar Khayyam, so Omar Khayyam became the bond, the link which allows English readers and Persian readers to commune in common literary understanding. That was the miracle of one poet translated by another poet.
افسوس که بی فایده فرسوده شدی و از داس سپهر سرنگون سوده شدی در داغ و ندامتا که تا چشم زدی نابوده به کام خویش نابوده شدی